It was a cold Tuesday evening when my phone buzzed, pulling me out of a dull corporate spreadsheet I had been staring at for hours. A text from my 14-year-old son, Ethan, blinked on the screen. "Dad, I need to talk to you. Now." "It's about Mom." That alone sent a chill down my spine. Ethan never texted like that. My son was usually glued to his Xbox or arguing about curfews, not dropping cryptic, ominous messages. I called him back immediately, pacing the living room as my stomach twisted into knots. "Dad," Ethan stammered, his voice shaky. I saw Mom at the Red Moon Hotel. She was, with Uncle Josh." I froze. "My brother, Josh?" "No. That didn't make sense." "Slow down, Ethan," I said, forcing calm into my voice. "What are you talking about?" "They were doing things, Dad. Gross things. I don't even want to say it." I sent you the video," he said, his voice cracking before he hung up. "The video?" My hands trembled as I checked my messages. And there it was, a grainy, shaky clip filmed from a phone. Ethan must have followed her, the poor kid. I pressed play. For a moment, my mind couldn't process what I was seeing. The woman I had married, the woman I thought I knew better than anyone else, was there, tangled in the arms of my brother in a cheap, dimly lit hotel room. My chest tightened. My jaw clenched so hard it hurt. It felt like someone had poured gasoline over my soul and struck a match. In one stupid, heartbreaking moment, my marriage of 15 years went up in flames. I stared at the screen, trying to convince myself it wasn't real. But it was her. Chelsea. Her laugh, her blonde curls cascading down her shoulders, her unmistakable birthmark on her collarbone. And Josh, my flesh and blood, smiling as though nothing mattered. My first instinct? Fury. A tidal wave of it crashed over me. How dare they? How could they? And poor Ethan. My son had seen this. He had to witness his mother betray us both. I slammed my phone down and told Ethan to come home. He was staying at his friend's house, but I didn't want him anywhere near Chelsea. Not now. I needed time to think. I needed to figure out how to handle the hurricane that just ripped through my life. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the dark with my thoughts spiraling into every corner of rage, pain, and disbelief. Chelsea and I had our ups and downs, sure. But we built a life together. We had a kid. A mortgage. Memories that felt sacred, untouchable. How could she throw that all away so easily? When the door creaked open the next morning, I knew it was her. Chelsea waltzed in like it was just another day, her high heels clicking against the hardwood floor. She barely glanced at me as she tossed her purse onto the counter. "Morning," she said casually, pouring herself coffee like nothing had happened. I stared at her, wondering how the hell she could act so normal. My pulse quickened. This wasn't the time to confront her, not yet. Not until I had a plan. But the sight of her acting so smug, so untouched by guilt, made my blood boil. Instead, I stood there silently, memorizing every move she made. Chelsea had no idea her charade was over, and for once, I had the upper hand. By the end of the day, I knew what I needed to do. Chelsea's betrayal wasn't just a betrayal of me, it was a betrayal of Ethan too. And she didn't deserve a family she treated like disposable garbage. The next morning, while she was out running errands, I packed my things, took Ethan out of school early, and left her a note she would never forget. On the counter, next to her cold coffee cup, sat the divorce papers, a photo of the two of them from that hotel video, and a simple message in my handwriting. "You chose him. You lost us. Don't look for me or Ethan, we're gone for good." Chelsea didn't come home until late that evening. I had left hours earlier with Ethan, driving aimlessly at first until I found a small motel outside of town. It was nothing special, a rundown joint with peeling wallpaper and a bed that creaked if you so much as breathed on it, but it was ours for now. Ethan was quiet the whole ride, probably processing everything he'd seen. I wanted to say something comforting, something fatherly, but I didn't have the words. How do you explain betrayal to a kid who just had his world ripped apart? Back at the house, I imagined Chelsea walking through the door, expecting the usual routine. The sight of her pouring herself coffee that morning, calm as ever, flashed in my mind again, and it made me sick. She was probably humming some cheerful tune, oblivious to the storm she had caused. Then, I pictured the exact moment she saw the divorce papers on the counter. I knew Chelsea well enough to anticipate her reaction. First, confusion. She'd scan the note, frowning, her brain racing to connect the dots. Then, realization would hit, and with it, panic. She'd check Ethan's room, my office, the garage, empty. Every room she walked into would echo with the truth: we were gone. When my phone buzzed around 9 p.m., I wasn't surprised. It was her, of course. I didn't pick up. A few minutes later, a string of text messages came flooding in. Where are you? Is this a joke? Come home. Ethan needs me. Answer the phone, Chris. This is ridiculous. I stared at the messages, my jaw tightening with every word. Ethan needs her? The audacity of that woman. She didn't seem too worried about Ethan when she was busy shacking up with Josh at the Red Moon Hotel. Chelsea called again. This time, I answered. What the hell is going on, Chris? She snapped before I could even say hello. I think you know exactly what's going on, I replied, my voice cold. I know about you and Josh. There was a pause, a sharp intake of breath on her end. Good. I wanted her to feel cornered. What are you talking about? She stammered, trying to play innocent. Don't play dumb, Chelsea. Ethan saw you. He recorded you. At the hotel. With Josh. Silence. For a second, I thought she'd hung up, but then I heard her laugh, a short, bitter sound that made my skin crawl. Oh, for God's sake, Chris. You're being dramatic, she said, her tone dripping with disdain. It wasn't what you think. Josh and I were just talking. Talking? Really? Because it didn't look like talking to me, I shot back, my voice rising. And even if it was, what kind of mother drags her son into this mess? Ethan saw you, Chelsea. He saw you. Do you even realize what that's done to him? She didn't respond right away. When she did, her voice was sharp and defensive. Don't you dare put this on me. You're the one who left, Chris. You abandoned your family like a coward. Ethan deserves better than this nonsense. I almost laughed at the sheer hypocrisy. You don't get to pull the family card after what you did. You made your choice, Chelsea. And now you get to live with it. Her voice changed then, less defensive, more desperate. Chris, please. Let's talk about this. I messed up, okay? But you can't just take Ethan and disappear. He's my son too. Was he your son when you were sneaking around with Josh? I asked, my voice cracking. Was he your son when you lied to my face every day for God knows how long? You don't get to claim the moral high ground here, Chelsea. Not after everything you've done. For a moment, I thought I heard her crying. But if she was, it didn't last long. She quickly switched back to anger, a tactic I'd seen her use before. Whenever Chelsea felt cornered, she lashed out. You're such a self-righteous jerk, she spat. Do you know how hard it's been living with you? You're boring, Chris. Predictable. You spend more time at work than you do with me or Ethan. And Josh. Josh made me feel alive again. I'm not going to apologize for that. Her words hit me like a freight train. Boring? Predictable? I had sacrificed everything for her, for us. I worked long hours to keep a roof over our heads, to give her the life she wanted. And this was how she repaid me? By tearing our family apart and then blaming me for it? I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm. You can justify it however you want, Chelsea. But at the end of the day, you're nothing more than a liar and a cheat. Ethan and I deserve better than that. And what about Ethan? She snapped. You think he's better off without his mother? Do you know what kind of damage you're doing to him? I clenched my fist, my nails digging into my palm. The only damage being done to Ethan is from you. He saw everything, Chelsea. You think he'll ever look at you the same way again? That shut her up. For the first time, she didn't have a comeback. I ended the call before she could say anything else. My hands were shaking as I set the phone down. Part of me felt a grim satisfaction in finally standing up to her, but another part of me, a smaller, quieter part, felt a pang of sadness. No matter how much I hated her in that moment, this wasn't how I had imagined our life turning out. I looked over at Ethan, who was lying on the bed with his headphones in, staring at the ceiling. He looked so lost, so small. And for the first time in my life, I didn't know how to fix things. The next day, the silence between Ethan and me was deafening. He barely spoke, picking at the takeout breakfast I had brought back to the motel. I couldn't blame him. What could he possibly say? I had dragged him into this disaster, and now he was caught in the middle of something no kid should ever have to endure. As I sipped the lukewarm coffee, my phone buzzed again. Chelsea. I ignored it. Then it buzzed again. And again. I finally turned it off, shoving it into my bag. I didn't need to hear her voice. Not now. Maybe not ever. But when the motel phone rang, yes, the landline, I knew she wasn't going to give up. I stared at it, my jaw clenched, before reluctantly picking it up. Chris, her voice came through, sharp and impatient. You can't run forever. You think hiding in some motel is going to solve this? Be a man and come home. We need to talk. No, Chelsea, I said coldly. You need to talk. I've already heard enough. I didn't cheat on you, she snapped, her tone defensive but also laced with panic. That video, Ethan doesn't know what he saw. Josh and I were just catching up, that's all. It's not what you think. Stop lying, I said, my voice low and steady. Ethan didn't just see you, Chelsea. He recorded you. You think he's too dumb to know the difference between catching up and, whatever the hell that was? She hesitated, and I could hear the gears turning in her head, searching for another excuse. Finally, she sighed dramatically. Fine. You want the truth? I kissed him, okay? But that's it. One mistake, Chris. One stupid mistake because I was feeling unloved. I laughed bitterly. Unloved? That's what you're going with? You're the victim now. I am, she shouted, her voice cracking. You don't see me, Chris. You haven't seen me in years. All you care about is work, bills, schedules. I needed more. I needed someone who. Save it, I cut her off. Don't you dare turn this on me. I broke my back for this family. I gave you everything. And what did you do? You threw it all away for Josh. My own brother. Do you even hear yourself? The line went quiet again, but this time it wasn't hesitation. It was anger. You're so perfect, aren't you? She spat. Chris, the saint. Chris, the martyr. Maybe if you'd spent half as much energy on our marriage as you did on your precious career, none of this would have happened. I felt my blood boiling. She was still trying to deflect, still refusing to take any accountability. I leaned forward, gripping the phone tightly. This isn't about me, Chelsea. This is about you. Your lies. Your choices. And now, it's about Ethan. He deserves better than this circus you've turned our lives into. I want to see my son, she said suddenly, her voice firm. You can't just take him away from me. I'll call the cops if I have to. Go ahead, I said. Call them. Tell them how you abandoned your family for my brother. See how that plays out. She hung up. For a moment, I sat there, the phone still pressed to my ear, trying to process the whirlwind of emotions that conversation had stirred up. Anger. Betrayal. Sadness. But most of all, exhaustion. I had spent the last 24 hours running on adrenaline, and it was starting to catch up to me. But there was no time to rest. I had to keep moving. I had to stay ahead of her. Chelsea wasn't going to give up easily, not because she loved me or Ethan, but because she couldn't stand to lose. She would fight tooth and nail to maintain her image, to rewrite the narrative so she came out looking like the victim. And I wasn't going to let that happen. Later that afternoon, while Ethan was napping, I got a call from an unknown number. I almost didn't answer, assuming it was Chelsea using another phone. But something told me to pick up. Chris, the voice on the other end said, hesitant but familiar. It was Josh. What the hell do you want? I asked, my grip tightening on the phone. Look, man, I want to explain, he said. It's not what you think. I let out a bitter laugh. Really? Because what I think is that you slept with my wife. Is that wrong? It wasn't like that, he insisted. She came to me. She was upset, saying you were neglecting her, and I don't know, man. One thing led to another. One thing led to another. I repeated, my voice rising. You're my brother, Josh. My brother. You're supposed to have my back, not this. I messed up, he admitted, his voice low. I know I did. But don't punish Ethan because of this. Let Chelsea see him. Don't drag him into our mess. Our mess? I snapped. No, Josh. This is your mess. You and Chelsea. You made this bed, and now you get to lie in it. Don't tell me how to protect my son. He sighed. Chris, I'm sorry. I really am. But she's not going to stop. You know how Chelsea is. He was right about that. Chelsea had a way of digging in her heels when she didn't get what she wanted. And right now, what she wanted was control. Over me. Over Ethan. Over the narrative of her betrayal. I hung up on Josh without another word. He wasn't worth it. None of this was. I had bigger things to focus on, like making sure Ethan never had to go back to that toxic, crumbling house we once called home. The next morning, the quiet sanctuary of the motel was shattered by a loud knock on the door. I froze, instinctively glancing at Ethan, who was sitting cross-legged on the bed, scrolling aimlessly on his phone. The look on his face told me he was just as anxious as I was. I moved cautiously to the door and peered through the peephole. My stomach dropped. Chelsea stood on the other side, her arms crossed, her lips pressed into a thin, furious line. Behind her was a man in a cheap suit, probably a lawyer or some sort of mediator she had hired in desperation. Open the door, Chris, Chelsea barked, her voice muffled but no less commanding. We need to talk. Now. I opened the door just enough to make it clear she wasn't getting inside. You've got some nerve showing up here. Her eyes flicked over me, full of contempt. I'm not playing games anymore. You've taken this too far. Ethan is my son, and I have every right to see him. You had every right to be a decent mother too, I shot back. But I guess that didn't matter much to you when you were sneaking off with Josh. The lawyer cleared his throat awkwardly, clearly regretting his life choices. Chelsea ignored him and leaned closer, her eyes narrowing. I'm not leaving until I see my son. If you don't let me, I'll make sure the courts take him away from you. Go ahead and try, I said, crossing my arms. The courts love parents who cheat on their spouses and traumatize their kids. Ethan saw you, Chelsea. He knows what you are. Her face turned bright red. For a second, I thought she might actually explode, but then she plastered on one of her fake smiles, the kind she used when she wanted to manipulate someone. Chris, she said, her voice suddenly softer. Let's not do this. We're both hurting right now. Let me talk to Ethan, please. He needs his mother. Is that what you think? I said, my voice low and dangerous. Because Ethan hasn't said one word about you since we left. You think he wants to see you after what you put him through? That's not fair, she snapped, her fake kindness evaporating. I made a mistake, okay? People make mistakes, Chris. But you don't get to punish me by stealing my son. You didn't make a mistake, Chelsea. You made a choice, I said coldly. And now you get to live with it. Chelsea's lawyer finally decided to speak up, probably realizing his client was digging herself into a hole. Mr. Anderson, he began, adjusting his tie nervously. I think it's in everyone's best interest to come to an agreement. Mrs. Anderson just wants to see her son. Surely, we can work something out without resorting to legal action. I stared at him, unimpressed. Legal action? You mean like divorce papers? Because I already left those on the counter. If Chelsea wants to fight for custody, she's welcome to try. But she'll lose. The lawyer hesitated, clearly unsure of how to respond. Chelsea, however, was done pretending. She shoved past him and stepped closer to me, her eyes blazing. You think you're so righteous, don't you? She hissed. Like you've never made a mistake in your life. You're pathetic, Chris. Running away like a coward, hiding in this dump with Ethan. Do you really think you're better than me? I don't need to be better than you, I said, keeping my voice steady. I just need to be better for Ethan. And that's not hard to do. She flinched, but she wasn't done. You're going to regret this, she said, her voice trembling with barely contained rage. You can't keep him from me forever. I'll fight you every step of the way. I'll make sure you. Enough. The voice wasn't mine. It was Ethan's. Both Chelsea and I turned to see him standing in the middle of the motel room, his face pale but determined. He looked at his mother with an intensity one had never seen before. Stop it, Mom, he said, his voice shaking. Just stop. You're not making this better. You're making it worse. Chelsea's face softened instantly, shifting into her manipulative, motherly tone. Ethan, sweetheart, I just want to see you. I've missed you so much. Please, come here. But Ethan didn't move. No, he said firmly. I don't want to go with you. Her face fell. Ethan, don't say that. I know you're upset, but we can fix this. We can be a family again. We were never a family, he said, his voice cracking. Not if you could do something like this. You lied to us, Mom. To me. And I don't want to see you right now. Chelsea looked like she had been slapped. For the first time, she didn't have a response. Her eyes darted to me, full of desperation, but I said nothing. This wasn't my battle to fight. After a long, agonizing pause, she turned and stormed out, dragging her hapless lawyer with her. The door slammed behind them, leaving the motel room eerily quiet. Ethan sank onto the bed, his hands shaking. I hate her, he whispered, his voice barely audible. I sat down beside him, putting an arm around his shoulders. You don't have to hate her, I said softly. But you don't have to forgive her either. Not until you're ready. He nodded, leaning into me as the weight of everything finally hit him. I knew this wasn't over. Chelsea wasn't the type to give up easily, and there was no doubt in my mind that she'd be back. But for now, we had each other. And that was enough. 2 days passed without a word from Chelsea, which should have felt like a relief. But in reality, the silence was unnerving. I knew her too well to believe she'd let this go so easily. Chelsea wasn't the type to lose gracefully, she'd come back swinging, and when she did, I'd have to be ready. Ethan and I were finally starting to settle into a routine at the motel. I let him skip school for now, it seemed cruel to force normalcy on him after everything. We spent our days talking, watching movies, and trying to rebuild some semblance of trust between us. He was opening up, slowly but surely, and I was trying my best to be the father he needed. But then, on the third morning, my phone buzzed with a notification that made my blood run cold. It was an email from Chelsea's lawyer, marked urgent. The subject line read, "Emergency Custody Hearing Notice." I stared at the screen, my heart pounding in my chest. She wasn't just coming after me, she was trying to take Ethan away. "Dad?" Ethan's voice broke through my thoughts. He was sitting on the edge of the bed, watching me with worried eyes. "What's wrong?" I forced a smile, tucking my phone into my pocket. "Nothing, buddy. Just some paperwork I need to deal with." He didn't look convinced, but he didn't press me. I stepped outside to make a call, my hands shaking as I dialed the number of a family lawyer I had used years ago for some minor estate planning. When she picked up, I explained the situation as quickly and clearly as I could. "Chris," she said, her tone serious. "If she's filed for emergency custody, you need to act fast. Judges don't mess around with these cases." "When's the hearing?" I opened the email again, dread pooling in my stomach. "Tomorrow. 9 a.m. She sighed. "That's tight, but not impossible. I'll start prepping right away. But you need to be ready for anything, okay? Chelsea's probably going to paint you as unstable, unfit, or even abusive. Do you have evidence of her affair? Anything that shows she's the one who's unfit?" "I have a video," I said grimly. "Ethan recorded it. And I have the divorce papers I left on the counter, she never signed them." "Good," she said. "We'll use everything we can. Just stay calm and stick to the facts. Don't let her get under your skin." Easier said than done, I thought as I hung up. The next morning, I dressed in my best suit, a relic from a job interview years ago, and drove Ethan to a friend's house. I didn't want him anywhere near that courtroom. When I arrived at the courthouse, Chelsea was already there, sitting at a table with her lawyer. She looked pristine, as always, dressed in a sleek black dress with her hair perfectly styled. But her eyes betrayed her, there was desperation behind them, a crack in her carefully curated mask. Her lawyer stood as I entered, offering a handshake I didn't take. "Mr. Anderson," he said smoothly. "I hope we can resolve this amicably." I ignored him and took my seat, my own lawyer arriving moments later. The judge entered, a stern-looking woman in her 50s, and the hearing began. Chelsea's lawyer wasted no time painting me as an unfit father. "Your Honor," he began, his voice dripping with concern. "My client has serious concerns about Mr. Anderson's ability to provide a stable environment for their son. He removed Ethan from the family home without notice, took him to an undisclosed location, and has refused all attempts at communication." "That's not true." I interjected, but my lawyer placed a calming hand on my arm. The judge raised an eyebrow. "Mr. Anderson, you'll have your turn." Chelsea sniffled dramatically, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. "I just want my son back, Your Honor. I made a mistake, but I love Ethan more than anything. Chris is, he's vindictive. He's trying to punish me by keeping Ethan away. I clenched my fists under the table, struggling to keep my composure. This was exactly what my lawyer had warned me about. Chelsea was twisting the narrative, trying to make herself look like the victim. When it was my turn to speak, I stood, my heart pounding. "Your Honor," I began, "I didn't take Ethan to punish Chelsea. I took him to protect him. My wife, soon-to-be ex-wife, has been having an affair with my brother. Ethan caught her in the act. He recorded it. He saw everything. That's the kind of trauma he's dealing with right now." The judge's eyes narrowed. "You have evidence of this?" I nodded, pulling out my phone and handing it to my lawyer, who passed it to the judge. She watched the video in silence, her expression growing grimmer by the second. When it ended, she looked at Chelsea. "Mrs. Anderson, do you have anything to say?" Chelsea's mask cracked. It was a mistake," she stammered. "It didn't mean anything. And Chris has been emotionally distant for years. I was lonely." The judge cut her off. "Loneliness is not an excuse to cheat on your spouse, especially when it impacts your child. This is deeply troubling, Mrs. Anderson." Chelsea's lawyer tried to salvage the situation, but it was clear the damage was done. When the judge made her ruling, my heart soared. "For now," she said, "custody will remain with Mr. Anderson. Mrs. Anderson will have supervised visitation, pending further evaluation." Chelsea's face twisted in anger, but she said nothing. As I walked out of the courtroom, a wave of relief washed over me. For the first time in days, I felt like I could breathe. The judge's ruling gave me temporary relief, but I knew Chelsea wouldn't go down quietly. For Chelsea, losing wasn't an option, it was a personal affront, and she wasn't about to let me walk away with Ethan without a fight. That night, as Ethan and I drove back to the motel, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. And I was right. The next morning, I woke up to a barrage of messages and missed calls. Most of them were from unknown numbers, and when I finally picked up the phone, a woman's voice on the other end greeted me. "Mr. Anderson? This is Tricia from Child Protective Services. We've received a report alleging neglect and emotional abuse in your household. We need to schedule a visit to speak with you and your son." My heart dropped. "What?" I said, my voice sharper than I intended. "Who reported this?" "I'm afraid I can't disclose that," Tricia replied. "But we take all allegations seriously, and it's important that we investigate." I didn't need her to tell me who had filed the report. Chelsea. It had her fingerprints all over it. She was trying to weaponize the system against me, to paint me as the villain and force me into a corner. "Fine," I said, my voice tight. "When do you want to come by?" "We'll need to visit as soon as possible," she said. "Can we come today?" After arranging a time, I hung up, my hands trembling with rage. How low could Chelsea sink? I had already fought her in court, exposed her lies, and won temporary custody of Ethan. But now she was dragging CPS into this, trying to paint me as an abusive father. I had to give her credit, it was a bold move, even for her. When the CPS worker arrived that afternoon, I was ready. I had spent hours preparing, cleaning the motel room, organizing Ethan's schoolwork, and making sure every detail of our lives was above reproach. Ethan sat beside me as Tricia conducted her interview, his face pale but determined. "Ethan," Tricia said gently, "can you tell me about your dad? How does he treat you?" Ethan glanced at me, then back at Tricia. "My dad's great," he said firmly. "He's always there for me. He took me away from my mom because she lied to us. She did something bad." Tricia nodded, jotting down notes. "And has your dad ever raised his voice at you? Or made you feel unsafe?" "No," Ethan said, shaking his head. "Never. He's the best." When it was my turn, Trisha asked about the situation with Chelsea, and I didn't hold back. I told her everything, about the affair, the video, the court ruling, and Chelsea's escalating attempts to manipulate the situation. "I'm not trying to alienate my son from his mother," I said firmly. "But he needs stability right now, and Chelsea is incapable of providing that. She's not thinking about Ethan, she's only thinking about herself." Trisha listened carefully, asking follow-up questions and taking notes. By the time she left, I felt cautiously optimistic. She had seen through Chelsea's lies, and I hoped her report would reflect that. But Chelsea wasn't done. A few days later, she showed up at Ethan's school. She wasn't supposed to have unsupervised contact with him, but that didn't stop her from sweet-talking the school secretary into letting her sit in the parking lot and wait for him to come out. When Ethan saw her, he froze. He later told me that she had waved at him, calling out, "Ethan. Sweetie. Come talk to me." But Ethan had turned around and walked straight back into the school, asking to call me instead. When I arrived, furious and ready to confront her, she was gone. I filed a formal complaint with the court that same day. It didn't stop her, though. Over the next week, Chelsea's harassment escalated. She left voicemails, begging Ethan to just give her a chance. She showed up at places she thought we might be, restaurants, parks, even the motel, though I refused to let her in. One night, as I sat in the dark, staring at my phone, a new thought occurred to me. What if Chelsea wasn't working alone? Josh. Of course. She wasn't smart enough to orchestrate all this on her own. Josh was helping her, pulling strings, maybe even funding her ridiculous schemes. The realization made my stomach churn. My own brother was still trying to ruin me. I decided to confront him. The next morning, I drove to his apartment and pounded on the door until he opened it, looking disheveled and surprised. "Chris," he said, blinking at me. "What are you doing here?" "I'm here because I know what you're doing," I said, shoving the door open and stepping inside. "Chelsea's been pulling every dirty trick in the book to come after me, and I know you're helping her." Josh's face darkened. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't play dumb," I snapped. "She doesn't have the resources to pull this off on her own. Someone's backing her, and I know it's you." He hesitated, his jaw tightening. "Look, Chris, I'm not involved in whatever she's doing, okay? Yeah, we had a thing. But I'm done with her. She's crazy." "Crazy?" I repeated, my voice rising. "You're just figuring that out now? You destroyed my family, Josh. You destroyed your family. And now you're trying to help her take my son? What the hell is wrong with you?" "I'm not helping her," he shouted back. "Do you think I want to deal with her drama? She's been calling me non-stop, trying to get me to help her, but I've ignored her. You think I want anything to do with this mess?" For a moment, I studied him, trying to decide if he was lying. His eyes were bloodshot, his face pale, and for once, he actually looked guilty. Maybe he wasn't helping her anymore, but that didn't make him innocent. "If I find out you're lying," I said, my voice cold, "I'll make sure you regret it." And with that, I walked out, slamming the door behind me. A week passed, and for the first time since Chelsea had reappeared in my life, things seemed quiet. Too quiet. The calls stopped, the texts stopped, and even her attempts to ambush Ethan had ceased. At first, I thought maybe the court ruling and CPS visit had been enough to scare her off. But deep down, I knew better. Chelsea wasn't the kind of person to walk away without a fight. And then, the storm broke. It was a Friday night. Ethan and I had just finished eating pizza, and he was sprawled on the motel bed, watching one of those mindless superhero movies he loved. I was checking my email when a loud knock rattled the motel door. My heart jumped into my throat. I glanced at Ethan, who looked equally alarmed. "Stay here," I said, grabbing my phone just in case. When I opened the door, I was met with two police officers standing on the threshold, their faces grim. Behind them, Chelsea stood, arms crossed and smirking like she had just won the lottery. "Mr. Anderson," one of the officers said, his tone professional but firm. "We've received a report of child endangerment. We need to speak with you and your son." I clenched my fists, my pulse roaring in my ears. Child endangerment? What are you talking about? Chelsea stepped forward, her expression dripping with fake concern. "Chris, please, don't make this harder than it needs to be. I just want to make sure Ethan is safe. He's my son too." "Don't you dare," I growled, pointing a finger at her. "You don't get to stand there and pretend you care about Ethan after everything you've done." The officers exchanged a glance. "Sir, we need to ask you to step aside so we can speak to your son." I didn't want to let them in. Every instinct in my body told me to slam the door in their faces and protect Ethan from this circus. But I knew that would only make things worse. With a deep breath, I stepped aside and let them in. Ethan was sitting up on the bed, wide-eyed and pale. One of the officers approached him gently, crouching to his level. "Hi, Ethan. I'm Officer Daniels. Do you mind if I ask you a few questions?" Ethan glanced at me, and I gave him a small nod. "Okay," he said quietly. For the next 10 minutes, the officer asked him about everything, how I treated him, whether he felt safe, and if anything had happened to make him uncomfortable. Ethan answered every question calmly and confidently, assuring them that he was fine and that I was a good dad. Meanwhile, I stood by the door, watching Chelsea's smug expression slowly melt into frustration. When the officers finally stood, Officer Daniels turned to me. "Mr. Anderson, based on what we've seen and heard, there's no indication of any danger to your son. We'll be filing a report to that effect." "Thank you," I said, relief washing over me. Chelsea, however, wasn't done. "Wait," she said, her voice rising. "You can't just leave it at that. Chris is manipulating him. Ethan's too scared to tell the truth. He's only saying what his father told him to say." Officer Daniels frowned. "Ma'am, we've seen no evidence of that. Your son appears to be safe and well cared for." "But..." "Ma'am," the officer cut her off. "If you have further concerns, you're welcome to take them up with the family court. But as far as we're concerned, this case is closed." Chelsea's face twisted with rage, and for a moment, I thought she might explode. But then she turned on her heel and stormed out, slamming the door behind her. The officers followed, leaving me and Ethan alone once again. The next morning, I woke up to another surprise, this time in the form of a letter shoved under the motel door. When I opened it, my stomach turned. It was from Chelsea's lawyer, informing me that she was filing a motion to overturn the custody ruling. She was accusing me of alienating Ethan from her, and she wanted full custody. "She's not going to stop, is she?" Ethan asked quietly. He was sitting on the bed, his knees pulled up to his chest. He looked older than his 14 years, his face weighed down with the kind of stress no kid should have to endure. "No," I admitted, sitting down beside him. "She's not." "What do we do?" he asked, his voice small. I hesitated. Part of me wanted to fight her in court again, to expose every one of her lies and ensure she never came near us again. But another part of me, the part that was exhausted from weeks of constant battles, wondered if it was worth it. How much more could Ethan take? How much more could I take? As I sat there, trying to come up with an answer, my phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. When I opened it, my blood ran cold. The message was short but chilling: "If you don't bring Ethan back, I'll make sure you regret it." Attached to the message was a photo of Ethan and me outside the motel, clearly taken from a distance. I jumped to my feet, my heart pounding. "Ethan, pack your things. Now." "Why?" he asked, alarmed. Just do it, I said, trying to keep my voice calm. We're leaving. As he scrambled to gather his things, I called my lawyer and explained the situation. She told me to file a police report immediately and suggested that I take Ethan somewhere safe, somewhere Chelsea couldn't find us. I didn't need to be told twice. Within 30 minutes, we were on the road, heading toward a family friend's cabin in the mountains. It was remote, secure, and far enough away from Chelsea's reach to give us some breathing room. But as I drove, one thought kept gnawing at me: Chelsea was escalating. She wasn't just trying to manipulate the courts anymore. She was trying to intimidate me, to scare me into giving up. And if she was willing to stoop this low, what would she do next? The cabin was everything I hoped it would be: isolated, quiet, and surrounded by towering pine trees that felt like sentinels guarding me and Ethan from the storm that was Chelsea. For the first day or two, it felt like we could finally breathe. Ethan seemed calmer, and I allowed myself to hope that maybe, just maybe, this nightmare was coming to an end. But the peace didn't last. On the third evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountains and the cabin was swallowed by shadows, there was a knock at the door. It wasn't the friendly, casual kind of knock. It was loud, insistent, and full of purpose. My stomach sank. "Dad?" Ethan whispered, his eyes wide. "Who is it?" "I don't know," I said, grabbing the hunting rifle that the cabin's owner had left behind. "Stay in your room and lock the door. Don't come out until I say it's safe." Ethan hesitated but nodded, retreating to his room and closing the door behind him. I approached the front door cautiously, peering through the peephole. My worst fears were confirmed. It was Chelsea. But she wasn't alone. Standing behind her, smirking like the devil himself, was Josh. My grip on the rifle tightened as I swung the door open, keeping the barrel pointed at the ground, for now. "What the hell are you doing here?" I demanded. Chelsea's smile was icy. "I came for my son." "Where is he?" "You have no right to be here," I said, my voice low and dangerous. "The court ruled against you. You're breaking the law just standing on this porch." Josh chuckled, stepping closer. "Come on, Chris. Don't be so dramatic. We're just here to talk." "Talk?" I spat. "You mean harass and intimidate? How did you even find us?" Chelsea crossed her arms, her smirk widening. "You really think you can run from me? I'll always find you, Chris. You can't hide Ethan forever." "Go home," I said, leveling the rifle at them now. "Before I call the cops." Chelsea's smile faltered, but Josh didn't flinch. "Put the gun down, Chris," he said, his voice calm and mocking. "You're not going to shoot your own brother." "You stopped being my brother the moment you slept with my wife," I snapped. "Don't push me, Josh. You don't know what I'm capable of." Josh raised his hands in mock surrender. All right. No need to get all worked up. But let's be real, Chris. You're in over your head. Chelsea's not going to stop, and the courts? They're a joke. They'll always side with the mother. You're fighting a losing battle." I didn't respond. My finger hovered over the trigger, and for a moment, I actually considered it. But then I heard a sound behind me, a creak of floorboards. I turned slightly, just enough to see Ethan standing in the hallway, his face pale but defiant. "Mom, just go," he said, his voice shaking but steady. "I don't want to be with you. I want to stay with Dad." Chelsea's expression twisted into something ugly, a mask of fury and desperation. "Ethan, sweetheart, you don't mean that. Your father's been filling your head with lies. You don't understand, he's the bad guy here, not me." Ethan took a step closer, his small frame trembling but unyielding. "No, Mom. I understand everything. I saw what you did. You lied to us. You hurt us. And now you won't leave us alone. Just, stop. Chelsea's face crumbled. For a split second, I thought she might break, that the weight of her guilt might finally catch up to her. But then Josh stepped forward, his hand on her shoulder, and the moment passed. You hear that, Chelsea? I said, my voice hard. Even Ethan knows the truth. You've lost him. You've lost us. Go home. Chelsea opened her mouth to argue, but Josh grabbed her arm, pulling her back. Come on, Chelsea. Let's go. She resisted for a moment, her eyes locked on Ethan, but eventually, she relented. This isn't over, she hissed as Josh dragged her away. You can't keep him from me forever. I didn't lower the rifle until their car disappeared down the long, winding road. Then I turned to Ethan, who was still standing in the hallway, his eyes glossy with unshed tears. I'm sorry, I said, setting the rifle down and pulling him into a hug. I'm so sorry you had to go through this. It's not your fault, he whispered, his voice muffled against my chest. I just want it to be over. The next morning, I called my lawyer and told her everything. She assured me that Chelsea's actions had only strengthened my case and that we'd file for a permanent restraining order immediately. In the meantime, I made a decision. We couldn't keep running. It wasn't fair to Ethan, and it wasn't sustainable. So I started making plans to move to another state, somewhere far away where Chelsea couldn't reach us. It wouldn't be easy, but it was the only way to give Ethan the fresh start he deserved. 2 weeks later, we were on the road again, leaving the past behind us. Ethan was quiet but hopeful, and for the first time in months, I felt a glimmer of hope too. Chelsea might have tried to tear us apart, but in the end, she had only made our bond stronger. As we crossed the state line, I glanced at Ethan and smiled. New beginnings, buddy. Just you and me. He nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. Yeah. Just us.